6 months had passed since the day Unipark touched the untouchable. The galaxy had not stopped talking about it. On 1,000 worlds, beings of every shape and size watched the footage and debated its meaning. Some called her a hero, and others called her a fool who had simply been lucky, but no one could deny what they had seen. A human had done what no other species could do. She had reached across the void of fear and found connection with a creature that had killed everyone else who tried. Una did not care about the debates or the fame. She cared only about her daily visits to the habitat where the Vorkith waited for her like a dog waiting for its beloved owner. The creature had transformed over the months. Its constant pacing had stopped and the aggressive tension in its body had melted away. It spent most of its time near the door now, watching for her arrival, and when she entered it would make that soft keening sound that she had come to recognize as greeting. Other researchers had begun approaching it under her guidance. The process was slow and careful with each new person, spending weeks watching and learning before attempting contact. But one by one, they succeeded. Vorkith, that had killed 17 scientists, now allowed itself to be touched by a growing circle of beings who had learned to set aside their fear. The Galactic Conservancy took notice. They summoned Una to their headquarters on the Valorian homeworld to present her findings to an assembly of representatives from across known space. The journey took 3 weeks, and she worried about the Vorkith. Every day she was gone. Threx had promised to continue her protocols, and she trusted him. But she still felt the creature's absence like a physical ache. The Conservancy headquarters was a structure of impossible beauty, a living building grown from engineered coral that rose from an ocean of purple water. Inside its chambers gathered beings from dozens of species. Some she recognized and many she had never seen before. They looked at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism to outright hostility. A Valorian elder called the assembly to order and invited Una to speak. She stood before them, feeling very small and very human, but no longer feeling afraid. "I am here to talk about the Vorkith," she began. "But what I really want to talk about is fear." She paced slowly as she spoke, making eye contact with as many representatives as she could. "Every species in this room has fear," she said. "It is a survival mechanism, a gift from evolution that keeps us alive. But somewhere along the way, fear became something else. It became a barrier between us and everything we do not understand." She pulled up images on the central display, footage of the Vorkith in its habitat before her arrival. When the Conservancy captured this creature, they saw a predator. She continued. They built walls and installed weapons and approached it with the certainty that it would try to kill them. And because they expected violence, they found it. She changed the image to footage from her first contact. "I approached this same creature with a different expectation," she said. "I expected to find pain and loneliness and grief. And because that is what I looked for, that is what I found." A representative from a species she did not recognize raised a limb to speak. "You are suggesting that the creature's behavior was determined by our expectations," it said. "That seems unlikely. I am suggesting that our expectations shaped how we approached the creature." Una replied, "And how we approach determines what we receive. The Vorkith's death sense does not detect danger. It detects fear. It responded to our fear with defensive aggression, because that is what traumatized beings do." She paused and let her words settle over the assembly. "My species is young," she continued. "We have been traveling among the stars for only a few centuries, while some of you have been doing so for millennia. We are weaker than many of you and slower than most. By every measure that matters, we should be insignificant." She smiled. "But we are not insignificant, and I think I finally understand why." She walked to the center of the chamber where everyone could see her clearly. "Humans evolved alongside predators," she said. "We were prey before we were hunters. We learned that running from danger was not always the answer. Sometimes the answer was to turn toward the thing that frightened us and try to understand it." She gestured at the screen still, showing footage of the Vorketh. We tamed wolves and turned them into our companions. We rode horses across continents. We swam with sharks and climbed mountains that tried to kill us. Not because we were fearless, but because we refused to let fear make our decisions. An old Valorian in the back of the chamber spoke up. And you? Believe this is what separates humans from the rest of us? No. Una said, I believe every species in this room has the same capacity. You have simply forgotten how to use it. Fear has become comfortable. It tells you what to avoid and what to approach, and you have stopped questioning it. She took a deep breath. The Vorketh was not a monster. She said, it was a survivor, the last of its kind, grieving and alone and terrified. And for 40 years, everyone who approached it confirmed its worst fears about the universe. Her voice softened. All it needed was someone to show it that the universe could be different. A message arrived before she finished speaking. Threx appeared on a screen looking more animated than she had ever seen him. Dr. Park. He said, something remarkable has happened. He transmitted data to the central display. It showed audio patterns, complex waveforms that rose and fell in intricate sequences. The Vorketh has begun producing structured vocalizations. Threx explained. Our linguists believe it may be attempting to communicate. Una stared at the patterns with tears forming in her eyes. When did this start? This morning, Threx said. I showed it a holographic image of you as part of the daily enrichment protocol. It began making these sounds immediately and has not stopped. The assembly chamber fell silent. A creature that had been dismissed as a mindless predator was trying to speak. And it had started when it saw the face of the human who had shown it. Kindness. The vote was unanimous. Una was granted full authority over the Vorketh program. More importantly, humans were invited to join the Galactic Conservancy as permanent partners. Not consultants, but full members with equal standing. The journey back to Station Terminus felt longer than the journey out. Una spent most of it reviewing the data on the Vorketh's vocalizations and thinking about what came next. When she finally arrived and walked to the habitat, the creature was waiting for her. She pressed her hand to the barrier, and it pressed its snout to the same spot. I heard you were trying to talk to me, she said. The Vorketh made a sound, that familiar keen, but this time there was something different about it. A pattern, a rhythm, almost like a word trying to form. Una laughed and cried at the same time. We have so much to learn from each other, she whispered behind her. Threx and the other researchers watched in silence. They had witnessed something extraordinary over the past 6 months. Not just the taming of a predator, but the bridging of a gap that had seemed impossible, and they had learned something about humans that all their centuries of study had never revealed. Humans were not conquerors. They were not warriors or scientists or explorers. They were bridges. They stood between fear and understanding, between the familiar and the unknown, and they reached out with open hands, even when every instinct told them to run. The galaxy was vast and full of wonders and terrors beyond counting, but as long as there were humans willing to reach across the darkness, there was hope that connection could triumph over fear, and that was the most human thing of all. The keen echoed through the habitat and up through the observation feeds to the crowd that had gathered to watch. No one spoke. No one moved. They simply stared at the impossible scene before them. A human woman standing arm's length from the ultimate predator, and the ultimate predator crying like a lost child. Una kept her hand raised, and her hard-open tears were streaming down her face, but she made no move to wipe them away. I know, she whispered again. I know. The Vorketh's keening slowly faded into something softer. A series of low sounds that rose and fell like waves on a distant shore. It circled her once, twice, its massive body moving through the space with careful precision. Una turned with it, never breaking eye contact, never lowering her hand. On the third circle, the creature stopped. It stood beside her now rather than in front of her, its flank close enough that she could feel the heat. Radiating from its scales, it lowered its head until its snout was level with her palm, and then it pressed forward. The touch was gentle. Despite the creature's size, its scales were warm against her skin, smoother than she had expected, and she could feel the pulse of its heart. Through the contact, the Vorkith held itself perfectly still, as if afraid that any movement might break the spell. Yuna began to stroke its snout with slow, careful movements. "Good," she said softly. "You are safe. You are not alone anymore." Up in the observation deck, Threx had stopped breathing. Around him, the other Valorians stood frozen in postures of absolute shock. One of the older council members made a sound that might have been a prayer in some ancient language. On the screens, the image played out in perfect clarity. The human touching the Vorkith allowing itself to be touched. Everything they knew about predator behavior, everything they had believed for 200 years. Crumbling like sand in the wind, minutes passed. The Vorkith remained motionless under Yuna's hand, its eyes half closed in what could only be described as peace. Then slowly it began to move again, lowering its body to the ground in a gesture of submission that no Valorian had ever witnessed from an apex predator. It curled around Yuna like a living fortress, its massive form creating a protective circle with her at the center. She sat down beside it and leaned against its flank, feeling the rhythm of its breathing and the warmth of its body. She stayed there for hours. Sometimes she spoke, and sometimes she simply sat in silence. She told the creature about Earth, about the wolves that humans had turned into dogs, and the horses that had carried them across continents. She told it about her own losses, the grandmother who had died when she was young, and the friends she had left behind to chase her dreams among the stars. She told it that grief was not a weakness, but a measure of love, and that healing was possible even after the deepest wounds. The Vorkith listened. She could not say how she knew it, understood, but she felt certain that something in her words was reaching it. Perhaps it was the tone of her voice, or the chemicals in her tears, or simply the presence of another being that was not afraid. Whatever the reason, the creature stayed close, occasionally making soft sounds in response to her words. When she finally stood to leave, the Vorkith rose with her. It followed her to the habitat door and stood, watching as she stepped through the airlock. Just before the door closed, she turned and pressed her hand against the transparent barrier. The Vorkith pressed its snout to the same spot. From the other side, "I will come back," she promised. "Every day, I will come back." The door sealed between them, but the connection remained. Yuna walked back up the corridor on legs that trembled with exhaustion and emotion. She had been in the habitat for almost 6 hours when she emerged into the observation deck. The crowd was still there, larger now than when she had entered. They stared at her in absolute silence. Then Threx stepped forward and did something that shocked everyone present, even more than what they had just witnessed. He bowed. It was a deep bow, the kind reserved for the most honored elders of Valorian society. One by one, the other Valorians followed his example until the entire observation deck was filled with bowing aliens. Yuna stood among them, a small human woman covered in the scent of the ultimate predator, and she felt something shift in the galaxy around her. Threx rose and approached her with something like reverence in his compound eyes. "How?" he asked simply. Yuna considered the question. "On Earth we have a saying," she said. "To understand a predator, you must first stop being prey." I did not approach that creature as something to be feared. I approached it as something to be known. "You were not afraid," Threx said. "We watched your vital signs. Your heart rate was elevated, but your fear pheromones remained stable." "I was afraid," Yuna corrected gently. "But fear was not the only thing I felt. I also felt compassion and curiosity, and something that I can only call love. She looked back at the screen showing the habitat. The Vorkith had not moved from its spot by the door. That creature has been alone for 40 years. She continued. It lost its world and its child, and everyone who came near it reeked of terror. Today, for the first time, someone approached it with something other than fear. She turned back to Threx. It was not bravery that saved me, she said. It was empathy. The news spread across the station within hours. By the next day, it had reached the broader galactic networks. By the end of the week, the footage of a human woman petting the ultimate predator had been viewed by billions of beings on thousands of worlds, and everything began to change. The day arrived on a morning that felt like any other Yuna woke before the station's artificial dawn and dressed in simple clothes with no armor and no protective gear. She ate a small breakfast and drank tea that reminded her of home. Then she walked to the observation deck where half the station had gathered to watch her die. Word had spread through every corridor and laboratory. The human was going to enter the Vorkith enclosure. Some came out of curiosity, and some came out of respect. And many came because they could not believe anyone would be so foolish. Threx stood near the entrance to the habitat access corridor. His chitin had turned a pale shade that Yuna had learned meant anxiety. You do not have to do this, he said as she approached. I know. The Council has authorized me to offer you passage back to human space with full honors. He continued. No one would think less of you for accepting. Yuna touched his arm gently, a gesture that made him stiffen with surprise. Someone would, she said. Me. She moved past him toward the airlock that led to the habitat. The crowd parted before her like water around a stone. She heard whispers in a dozen languages and saw faces filled with emotions she could not name at the airlock. She paused and turned to face them all. I want you to watch, she said loud enough for everyone to hear. Not because I want witnesses to my death, but because I want you to see something that the galaxy has forgotten. She looked at their alien faces, so different from her own, yet filled with the same fears and hopes that lived in every thinking being. My species evolved on a world full of predators, she said. We were small and weak, and we should have been eaten into extinction. But we survived because we learned something important. She took a breath. We learned that the things we fear are not always our enemies. We learned that understanding can bridge the gap between hunter and hunted. We tamed wolves and rode horses and swam with sharks because we refused to let fear be the final word. She turned back to the airlock. Today, I am going to show you what that looks like. The airlock opened with a soft hiss and she stepped through into a corridor that led down into darkness. Behind her, the door sealed shut and she was alone. The corridor was long and curved and lit by dim orange lights that cast strange shadows on the walls. She walked slowly, letting her eyes adjust and letting her heart find its rhythm. She had spent 3 months preparing for this moment. She had watched the Vorkith for hundreds of hours. Until its movements were as familiar as her own heartbeat, she had studied its sounds until she could predict what it would do next. She had meditated and breathed and trained her body to remain calm in the face of danger. Now all that preparation would be tested. The corridor ended at another door, and beyond it lay the habitat. She could hear sounds from within. The scrape of claws on stone and the deep rumble of something massive breathing. Yuna placed her hand on the door panel. I see you, she whispered to the creature she could not yet see. I know you, and I am not afraid. The door opened. The habitat was larger than she had expected. A vast space filled with artificial rock formations and pools of dark water and shadows that seemed to move on their own. The air was warm and humid and smelled of something ancient and wild. She stepped inside and the door closed behind her. For a moment, everything was still. Then she heard it. The sound of something enormous shifting its weight in the darkness ahead. 2 red eyes opened in the shadows and fixed upon her with an intensity that made her soul tremble. The Vorkith emerged. It was even more magnificent up close than it had been on the screens. Its black scales rippled like liquid night as it moved, and its 6 limbs carried its massive body with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large. It stopped 20 meters away and lifted its head to taste the air. Una stood perfectly still. Her heart was beating fast, but her breathing remained slow and steady. She did not run. She did not reach for weapons. She did not carry. She simply stood and let the creature see her. The Vorkith made a sound, a low rumble that vibrated through the floor and up through her bones. It was tasting her fear. She knew, searching for the pheromones that would trigger its defensive rage, but she had trained herself well. Her fear was present, but it was not in control. It was a passenger in her mind, not the driver. She took a step forward. The crowd watching through the observation feeds gasped as one flexed his mandibles, clicked in rapid succession as he muttered something in his native language. The Vorkith's eyes narrowed, and it took a step toward her. In response, 20 meters became 15. Una kept walking. She moved slowly and deliberately, with her hands open at her sides and her eyes fixed on the creature's face. She did not look away, and she did not look down. 15 meters became 10. The Vorkith was close enough now that she could see the individual scales on its body and the way its claws left grooves in the stone floor. It could reach her in a single leap. It could end her life before she even had time to scream. But it did not attack. It stood there watching her with those ancient red eyes, and something shifted in its posture. The aggressive hunch of its shoulders relaxed slightly. The constant low growl in its throat faded to silence. Una stopped 3 meters away, close enough to touch if she reached out. She raised her hand slowly, palm open and fingers spread. "I know you," she said softly. "I know what you have lost. I know how much you have suffered, and I am so sorry." The Vorkith stared at her hand. For a long moment, nothing moved. Not the creature, not Una, not even the air itself. Then the Vorkith lowered its massive head and made a sound that no one in the station had ever heard before. It was a keen, high and mournful, like the cry of something that had forgotten how to cry. It was the sound of 40 years of grief finally finding a voice, and it broke Una's heart wide open. 3 weeks passed, and Una divided her time between her assigned duties and her secret obsession. During the day, she worked with the creatures in Sectors 7 through 12, cataloging behaviors and suggesting improvements to their habitats. The Valorians watched her with suspicion at first, but gradually their attitudes began to soften. She had a way with the predators that surprised them. She moved slowly and spoke softly, and never showed fear even when facing creatures that could kill her in seconds. At night, she studied the Vorkith. She had found ways to access more of the station's databases, and she pieced together every scrap of information about the creature's history. The picture that emerged broke her heart. The Vorkith had been captured during a desperate rescue mission as its home world burned. It had watched its planet die from the viewport of a ship piloted by beings it did not understand, the smaller Vorkith. The one that died had been its offspring, a child that it had tried to protect through the chaos of evacuation, only to lose it to grief and confusion within a year. After that, the adult Vorkith had changed. It became aggressive toward anyone who entered its enclosure. The researchers had assumed this was its natural predatory behavior. Finally emerging, Una knew better. She recognized the pattern from her work with traumatized animals on Earth. The Vorkith was not attacking because it was hungry or because it saw the researchers as prey. It was attacking because it was terrified and alone, and every being that approached it carried the scent of fear that reminded it of the worst moments of its existence. One evening, she requested a meeting with Conservator Thrax and the Valorian Council. They gathered in a circular chamber with screens showing all the habitats in the preserve. Una stood before them, feeling very small and very human. "I have completed my analysis of the Vorkith," she said. Threx's mandibles clicked with surprise. You were not authorized to study the Vorkith. I studied it on my own time using publicly available data. Una replied, what I found is important enough that I felt I had to share it. The council members exchanged glances, but none of them stopped her. She took a deep breath and began. The Vorkith is not aggressive by nature, she said. It is traumatized. The 17 researchers who died were not killed by a predator hunting prey. They were killed by a grieving parent defending itself against what it perceived as threats. A murmur ran through the council. One of the older Valorians leaned forward. Explain this theory, she demanded. Una pulled up her data on the central screen. Every researcher who entered that enclosure went in with protective gear and sedation equipment, she said. They were prepared for danger. They expected danger, and their bodies reflected that expectation through elevated heart rates and stress hormones and fear pheromones. She pointed to a graph showing the Vorkith's behavior patterns. The creature's death sense does not just detect fear. She continued, it interprets fear as a threat. When it senses a being that is afraid, it responds defensively, not offensively. Threx made a skeptical sound. You are saying that our researchers died because they were afraid. I am saying they died because the Vorkith is trapped in a cycle of trauma. Una said, every fearful being that approaches reinforces its belief that the universe is dangerous and hostile. It has not known safety or comfort in 40 years. She paused and looked at each council member in turn. Has anyone ever approached the Vorkith without fear? The silence that followed was answer enough. One of the younger Valorians spoke up. What you suggest is impossible, he said. Fear is a survival mechanism. It cannot simply be turned off. Every sentient being in the galaxy experiences fear when facing a creature that can kill them. Una nodded slowly. You are right, she said. Fear cannot be turned off, but it can be transformed. She stepped closer to the council's central platform. I am requesting permission to enter the Vorkith's enclosure. The chamber erupted in noise. Mandibles clicked and voices overlapped, and Threx rose to his full height with his chitin flashing angry purple. Absolutely not, he declared. We will not be responsible for another death, especially the death of a species representative, whose government would demand answers we could not provide. Then I will remove your responsibility, Una said calmly. She pulled up a document on her personal terminal. Human Diplomatic Autonomy Clause. She read aloud. In cases where a human representative chooses to undertake a risk that the host species deems unacceptable, the human may invoke autonomous action and absolve the host of all liability. The council fell silent. Threx stared at her with his 1,000-faceted eyes. You would invoke this clause, he said slowly. You would walk into that enclosure knowing that we believe you will die. Yes. Why? Una thought about the creature pacing in the darkness. She thought about 40 years of loneliness and grief and fear. She thought about her own species and how they had learned to walk among predators instead of running from them. Because someone has to try, she said. Because that creature has suffered long enough. Because I believe I can reach it in a way that none of you can. Threx was quiet for a long moment. The humans have a reputation, he said finally. They are called mad and reckless and foolish. They throw themselves into danger for reasons that make no sense to the rest of the galaxy. He paused. I am beginning to understand why. The council voted unanimously against her plan, but her invocation of the autonomy clause meant they could not stop her as the meeting ended. Threx approached her with something that might have been respect in his alien features. How will you do it? He asked. How will you approach that creature without fear? Una smiled. I will spend time with it, she said. I will watch it until I know it better than I know myself. I will learn its patterns and its sounds and its moods until it becomes familiar rather than frightening. That could take months. Then it will take months. She began her preparation that very night. She sat before the observation screen and watched the Vorkith for hours. She studied every movement of its massive body and every flicker of its red eyes. She listened to the sounds it made, the low rumbles and high keens and the clicking of its claws on stone. Day after day she returned to that screen. The other researchers thought she had lost her mind. Even Threx watched her with concern as she sat motionless before the image of the ultimate predator. But slowly something began to change. The fear that had tightened her chest when she first saw the creature began to fade. In its place grew something else, understanding, and with understanding came the beginning of something that felt almost like love. The shuttle descended through clouds of orange mist as Dr. Yuna Park pressed her face against the viewport, like a child seeing snow for the first time. Below her stretched the Galactic Wildlife Preserve on Keth 7, a moon that had been transformed over thousands of years into a sanctuary for the deadliest creatures in the known galaxy. She had dreamed of this place since she first read about it in the xenobiology archives back on Earth. Now she was here as the first human consultant ever, accepted by the Valorian Conservancy. The shuttle touched down on a platform that extended from station terminus, a massive structure that floated above the preserve like a watchful eye. Yuna grabbed her single bag and walked down the ramp into air that smelled like copper and distant rain. 3 figures waited for her at the end of the platform. They stood over 2 meters tall, with bodies covered in shimmering chitin that shifted between deep purple and black. Their compound eyes reflected her image 1,000 times as she approached. The tallest one stepped forward and made a clicking sound that her translator interpreted as speech. "I am Conservator Threx," the Valorian said in a voice like stones grinding together. "You are the human they sent." It was not a question, and it was not a welcome. Yuna bowed her head in the gesture of respect she had studied on the journey. "I am honored to be here, Conservator." Threx made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been disgust. "The honor is not ours to give," he said. "You are here because of the treaty between our governments, not because we believe you belong among us." The other 2 Valorians clicked their mandibles in agreement. Yuna kept her expression calm, even though her heart sank a little. She had expected resistance, but the coldness in their voices still stung. "I understand," she said. "I hope to prove my worth through my work." Threx turned and began walking toward the station entrance. "Follow me." "Human, I will show you to your quarters and explain the rules of this place." The station was enormous and filled with technology that made Earth's most advanced facilities look primitive. Screens covered every wall, showing live feeds from hundreds of habitats below. Creatures of every shape and size moved through artificial environments designed to mimic their homeworlds. Yuna saw predators with too many teeth and prey animals with too many eyes. She saw things that slithered and things that flew, and things that seemed to exist in more dimensions than she could perceive. But one screen drew her attention more than any other. It showed a habitat shrouded in darkness, where something massive moved through shadows that seemed alive. "What is that?" she asked. Threx stopped and followed her gaze. His compound eyes flickered with something that might have been fear. "That is the Vorkith," he said. "The crown jewel of our collection and the greatest danger on this station." Yuna moved closer to the screen. The creature emerged from the shadows for just a moment, and she caught her breath. It stood 4 meters tall on 6 powerful limbs. Its body was covered in scales so black they seemed to drink the light around them. Claws that gleamed like polished obsidian tipped each of its limbs, and its head was a nightmare of angles and teeth. "It is beautiful," Yuna whispered. Threx made that grinding sound again. "It is death," he corrected. "The Vorkith has killed every researcher who entered its enclosure. 17 of our finest scientists over 200 years. It hunts through infrared vision, an echolocation, and something we call death sense." "Death sense," Yuna repeated. "It can detect fear pheromones from kilometers away," Threx explained. When it senses fear, it attacks without hesitation and without mercy. No one goes near it anymore. We observe from a distance and nothing more. Yuna watched. The creature paced through its dark habitat. Back and forth, it moved in patterns that seemed random but felt purposeful. Something about its movements tugged at her mind. Where did it come from? She asked. A dead world called Vorkith Prime, Threx answered. The planet was destroyed by its own sun 40 years ago. We rescued this specimen before the end. It is the last of its kind. The last of its kind. Those words echoed in Yuna's mind as she watched the creature move. She had studied extinction events, and she had worked with animals on the edge of disappearing forever. She knew what loneliness looked like in a creature's behavior. I would like to review its behavioral data, she said. Threx's mandibles clicked sharply. That is not possible, he said. The Vorkith is too dangerous for anyone to study closely, especially a human who has been here for less than an hour. I am not asking to enter the enclosure, Yuna said. Just to see the records. The answer is no, Threx said firmly. You are here to consult on the lesser predators in Sectors 7 through 12. The Vorkith is beyond your clearance and beyond your understanding. He turned and continued walking. Yuna followed, but she could not stop herself from looking back at the screen. The Vorkith had stopped pacing. It sat motionless in the center of its habitat, staring at nothing with eyes that glowed faintly red in the darkness. That night, Yuna could not sleep. Her quarters were comfortable enough, with a bed that adjusted to her body and a window that showed the stars beyond the moon's thin atmosphere. But her mind kept returning to the creature in the dark habitat. She pulled up her personal terminal and searched through the public databases for any information about the Vorkith. Most of what she found confirmed what Threx had told her. Ultimate Predator 17 confirmed kills. Extremely dangerous. Do not approach under any circumstances. But buried in an old research paper from decades ago, she found something that made her sit up straight. The Vorkith had not been alone when it was captured. There had been another one, smaller and younger, brought to the station at the same time. It had died within the first year from what the researchers called failure to adapt. Yuna read that phrase over and over, failure to adapt. She knew what that really meant. The younger Vorkith had died of grief and stress, and the trauma of losing everything it had ever known, and the larger one had been alone ever since. Yuna stood and walked to her window. Somewhere below in that dark habitat, the Vorkith was pacing or sitting, or staring at shadows that held no comfort. She thought about the 17 researchers who had died. They had approached it as scientists studying a dangerous animal. They had gone in with tranquilizers and protective gear, and the certainty that they were the ones in control. And they had all been afraid. Every single one of them had carried fear in their bodies, like a beacon, and the Vorkith had sensed it and responded the only way a traumatized predator knew how. Yuna pressed her hand against the cold glass of her window. You are not hunting, she said softly to the creature she could not see. You are grieving. She made a decision in that moment that would change everything. She would find a way to reach the Vorkith. Not as a scientist studying a specimen, not as a human proving herself to skeptical aliens, but as one lonely creature reaching out to another. She did not know if it was possible. She did not know if she would survive the attempt, but she knew with absolute certainty that she had to try. The stars wheeled slowly overhead as Yuna began to plan, and somewhere in the darkness below, the ultimate predator lifted its head, as if it sensed that something in its universe was about to change.